All right.
Hello and welcome to the Oakland Aviation Museum. I'm your docent, Dan, and today we'll be showing you a virtually up-close tour inside and out of the Solent Mk III flying boat. Now, this Solent Mk III is the last intact example of this particular aircraft in the world. It was designed by the Short brothers in England during World War II for the Royal Air Force. It was intended to be an upgrade to the Sunderland long-range reconnaissance flying boat to hunt enemy submarines and rescue downed Allied aviators. But the war ended in 1945 before this aircraft could go into service. So in 1946, this aircraft, along with 5 others, was transferred to the Short plant at Belfast, Ireland, and converted to a 34-passenger flying boat. And in turn, it was leased to BOAC, that's the British Overseas Airways Corporation, known today as British Airways. Then in 1949, BOAC named this aircraft the City of Cardiff, and it began its brief career as an airliner on the 4.5-day route from London, England to Johannesburg, South Africa. The route was flown during daylight hours only at an altitude of only about 10,000 feet since the aircraft was not pressurized. It had stopovers at night in Sicily, Cairo, Egypt, anchoring on the Nile River, and at Lake Victoria in Africa. Then, in late 1950, these graceful Solent flying boats were replaced on the very route by the faster land-based aircraft like the DC-6 that could carry many more passengers. This aircraft then changed hands between a couple of other airlines in the South Pacific in the early 1950s, flying the inter-island routes from Tasmania to Fiji and between Honolulu and Tahiti. Flying boats on these routes were eventually replaced themselves by the Boeing 707 jetliner in 1958. In late July of 1958, this aircraft flew for the last time off San Francisco Bay and was beached at San Francisco Airport. In fact, Rod, if you have a photo of this, we actually found a photo of this 1958 image of San Francisco Airport. You can see in the lower right-hand corner there that this is a flying boat. Most likely this very flying boat beached in the fall of 1958 at San Francisco Airport. Look at that, with the bow facing to the left there into the water. But it was then purchased by Howard Hughes and was transferred and maintained in Oakland with her 2 sister ships under heavy guard for 9 years. They were never flown since. Eventually, this plane was purchased by 2 brothers, Rick and Randy Grant, in 1976. And in 1990, she was brought here to her present location and opened to the public at the Oakland Aviation Museum. You also might recognize this plane from its cameo appearance in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark as the flying boat that Indiana Jones flew to Nepal. So now let's take a look at this magnificent airliner from the past. First, I want to give you a tour inside the aircraft. This is a flying boat. And by flying boat, it means that it was exclusively to fly on and off of water. Inside the aircraft. And so let's see if anyone's home. Permission to come aboard, sir. Oh, fantastic. So this is Bill. Hello, Docent Bill. How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Thanks for letting us into this aircraft. Thank you.
We're just doing our final checks to get ready for our flight to Johannesburg.
Oh, that's great. So let me just give a quick little look at where we are here. So you can see the fine accommodations inside this aircraft. This here is the bar. The only airplane I've been in that has its own tiki bar. And then we're going to quickly take a quick look through here, just so you can see this. And then I'm going to walk back and we'll talk to Bill. And just so you know, everyone, we are going inside of an aircraft that is full of metal and full of electronic equipment, and so we may be losing some signal now and then. And when we do, I just want you to know that we'll be right back. There may be some drops off, and then our hosts will play some videos or show pictures for you to show you a little bit more about what this fine aircraft was about. Turn off my Bluetooth for a second here. See if we can get some better audio, and we'll head straight to the cockpit. Okay, how does everyone hear me? Sound good? Okay. So Bill, tell us a little bit about where we are in this aircraft.
We are in the Solent Mk aircraft. We've just come on board and we have the promenade deck or the cocktail lounge. And we're the aft end of the aircraft in the lower deck. We have the stairs for the upper deck here. And we are now going to go forward up to the cockpit.
And here we go. So you can see just how nice this club car seating was. Just the forepart and then back to the cockpit. So this here, we'll come back to this later, but I just wanted to give you a general idea of where you are in the aircraft. And this is the very nose. And then now we're going to go back and then we're going to go up the steps into the cockpit. Excuse me, Bill. We may drop out of signal here briefly. And now, here we are on the flight deck. This is a very rare sight because this has been closed to the public for a while. And so it's my pleasure to share the details of this great ship with you. Here is the navigator station, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I just want to get to a point where we're able to get some better signal. And then this is the cockpit. So now let's start here with the navigator. We're waiting for Bill to catch up to us to talk about the navigation system. This, you'll notice just as a glance here that this has three sets of flight instruments in this aircraft. One, of course, on the left side is for the pilot, and then the one set of flight instruments on the right is for the first officer or the co-pilot. And then back here, the navigator had their own set of navigation instruments where you'd see the same exact readings as the pilot and the first officer. The advantage of this would be that the navigator, who would be trying to figure out where you're going and where you are, getting position reports and making calculations, rather than constantly tapping the captain on the shoulder and saying, "What's our altitude? What's our direction? What does the gyro compass say?" He would have his own instruments, and so he would know exactly, have all the information at his fingertips in order to calculate where they were going, and how fast they were. So, Bill, tell us a little bit more about this station.
Here we have duplicates of the captain's instruments. We have the altimeter, airspeed indicator, a rate of climb indicator, and the radio compass, and the compass. They would normally use voice communication, but they have Morse code for a backup. And he has his map here. And back here is something quite unique. It's a knife switch, the switch between the Loran navigation system and the HF radio system. Of course, everything here is completely obsolete, but in its day, this was the top of the line. I believe the top two racks here are original, but not the lower racks. all these boxes would be very much smaller now. And in some cases, they'd be combined.
So this here, we're looking aft now. And you can see through there. The reason it's so hard to climb into this is because this is where the spar, providing the strength for the wings, would go through the fuselage of the aircraft. So you've got a front spar and you've got the rear spar there. And so you couldn't walk back and forth on the upper deck here. You would have to do quite a bit of gymnastics going through that opening right there. So it was quite a challenge whenever the captain would ask for a cup of coffee, because that's the galley right there. And so someone would have to crawl through that little dumbwaiter and then bring the coffee without spilling a drop up to the flight deck. Yeah, so we'll get a tour of the galley area and further aft later on, but this just gives you a rare view of what this is like inside the aircraft on the flight deck right here. So we're going to move over to the cockpit here, or the control cabin, as they would call it. We're going to talk a little bit about the devices you see. If there are any pilots aboard, you'll find a lot of this terminology recognizable. And on the right side there, on the first officer seat there, those are actually the original headsets for the aircraft. Not like the AirPods that we fly with now. I don't know if anyone flies with AirPods, but definitely vintage radio equipment. So here we have our control column, and it would be repeated on the port and the starboard. Because this is a flying boat, everything was called port and starboard, even though nowadays on aircraft we often say right and left. But because this is a maritime vehicle primarily and British, everything was port and starboard. So this is a 4-engine aircraft. This is the throttle quadrant right here. And on the throttle quadrant, you'll see, because there are 4 engines, you'll see 4 controls for each engine and multiple controls for each one of those engines. The blue levers here are the prop speed. So basically it changes the angle of the propeller. If you want to increase the prop speed so it goes faster, you're decreasing the angle of the propeller through the air. And when you're cruising, you want to have a higher angle of attack on the prop, which gives you more efficiency, but it gives you less power. It slows the prop down. And then that would be much more efficient. So you burn less fuel because you were just like swimming along like a easy strokes in a pool, because air is a fluid. And then up here, these are the throttles. So this would actually control the amount of fuel that was going to the engine. And the more fuel, this would be like the gas pedal in a car, except the difference is that it's not springy, where you set it and where you put it is how much fuel is going to the engines. And so that's how you get the power. And these levers up here control the mixture, fuel to air ratio for combustion in the engine, all the way forward to have the most fuel in the mixture, such as for takeoff. But then when you get to higher altitude, you want to pull these back. So you would be having less fuel going into the mixture because there's less oxygen at higher altitude. And so you would be adjusting this further back to make it leaner the higher that you went. These all have different balls on the levers. There's a phrase that you might have heard called balls to the wall. Well, that phrase actually originates from multi-engine aircraft, because you see all these balls on the throttle quadrant. You've got RPM, the prop, you've got the throttle, and you've got the mixture. And so if you wanted full power, you would put all the balls to the firewall. So that's what that phrase means. So for maximum power, balls to the wall. It was just an easy moniker to remember for pilots to know that they could very easily check that they had maximum thrust and power for whatever they needed for, particularly for takeoff and climbing, depending on their altitude. That is where that phrase comes from. These knobs here, because these were normally aspirated engines, they had a carburetor, and carburetors had a tendency to ice up. And they would ice up even in warm weather because of the narrow opening. And so what these would do is that you would turn this and you'd pull it out, and that would turn on a little heater to keep ice from forming in the carburetor, because if the carburetor froze up with ice, then the engine will quit. So that's what those are there for too. So here we have the fuel collectors. This is a a modification unique to the Mark III, because the Mark III, originally they would have a flight engineer, and so a flight engineer would be an additional seat in the aircraft, probably right behind the co-pilot here, and then they would run the engines. But just for efficiency wise, and because they could have one more paying passenger, this could carry 34 passengers at the time, which was twice the amount as the typical land aircraft could carry at the time that this came out, which is why this was a very popular aircraft for the route, especially. So without the flight engineer, the first officer and the pilot would be able to control their own mixture and engines. You can see that there are 12 fuel cells on the aircraft. They're all in the wing. The port ones are red and the starboard ones are green. And that's just like any boat, and frankly, just like any airplane now, where green is on the starboard side or the right side, and then red is on the port side or the left side. And the moniker to remember that we say is left is port, port is wine, wine is red. So left is port, port is wine, wine is red. So that's how you remember that the port side is the red side, because port is red like wine. And there you go. So what they would do with these is they would start with only probably the outboard fuel cells active. And then as they would fly along, they would change to the inboard fuel and also be able to switch fuel around. So Bill, tell us a little bit about this fuel switching that they would do.
Yeah, the fuel quantity, you have 12 fuel quantity indicators on the right-hand instrument panel down at the bottom. So they would watch, they would have, like he said, they would start at the outboard tanks. And when that tank started getting low, they would keep each side even, and they would switch over to the next tank. All the time, keep an eye on the fuel quantity indicators. And this,
So what would this burn per hour in fuel? It's something like 200, let's see, some odd.
I believe so. I can't say for certain.
So,
But there was provisions to cross-feed the fuel from one side of the aircraft to the other if it should become necessary.
right. And that's what these wheels on the outboard side of this. So this would be like forward and aft, and this would be back and forth between the engines. So they would do that if they needed to change the weight balance of the aircraft, or if one of the tanks ran dry, they could move it around.
They had a problem that would be common, but if that system is there in case it became necessary.
Yeah. So this here on the right side, you'll see it says dump chute handle. Well, what the dump chute handle is for is that we'll see when we go forward, there's a hatch, and one of the critical crew members on this aircraft was what was called a bowsman. That's different from a bosun's mate, but it's a bowsman. It's basically a person whose sole job was to pop out the front of the aircraft when they alighted on the water. They would pop out the front and they would be looking for the buoy that they could then grab to moor to. And there is no rudder. There is no propeller within the water, and there is no way to stop. There are no brakes on a float plane or a flying boat. So you had to control it just like you would a boat or another ship. And so what the bowsman would do is that one of the things that they had at their disposal was a pair of these canvas parachutes, little small drogue chutes that he would dump out the hatch in the bow, and then that would fill up with water and stop them very quickly if they needed to suddenly stop. It was just like opening up a parachute underwater, and it would just stop very quickly. If you wanted to start moving again, you would have to dump that chute. And so that's what this little handle is here. You wouldn't use it very often, but it's there if you need it. And when you're actually on the water, maneuvering around, you have a few things to control your speed and direction. And the main thing you'll use the throttles. You would use the outside engines because that would give you the most torque for like turning the airplane, because the engines would be on the outside. If you wanted to turn to the port, you would run up the starboard engine, and the starboard engine would pull the wing and the whole aircraft to the port side. And if you wanted to turn to the starboard, you would use the port engine and run that up, and then that would cause the wing where the engine is to move the aircraft to the starboard side. And so you would basically just be managing very gingerly the power using the outside engines as you're taxiing along on the water. But you know that those engines are still going around, and so they're still generating thrust. So up here, you would have a special. I don't know if you can see this in the light here, but you would have. There we go. So these are idle cutoff switches, and so the throttle would only slow the prop, but it would still be generating some thrust. And so to eliminate that thrust and to do micro motions going forward a little bit at a time, you would actually be turning the outboard engine or any engine off and on. So, and you would actually shut the engine off briefly in order to make sure that it wasn't generating the thrust. And so I see that someone is asking in that, yes, this aircraft did not have armament on it because it actually went into service after the war, but it was designed in order to carry arms, and we'll talk about that in the front. It was designed to carry waist guns, and it had a bow turret of I think it was twin or maybe quad 20 millimeters. The Brits loved 20 millimeter. And then it had a tail gunner with a twin set of 20 millimeters on the aft of the aircraft. So this is how you would go forward very briefly just by turning the engine on and off like this. These here, this is the feathering button. This is actually a pretty automatic thing here because there's a light in here. We'll take a quick look at the engines out here. On the engines, there were fire sensors in the fore part of the engine and in the aft part by the firewall. And that if those are activated, this light would come on and automatically a fire bottle would activate and try to extinguish the fire automatically, and this light would come on. And if necessary, if you had to kill the engine or if the engine killed on its own, you wouldn't want that prop to create drag because that would slow you down. So what they would do is they would feather it. You see how the propeller is facing front? You see the face of the prop providing lots of drag in the airstream. Well, what feathering would do is that it would actually turn that prop this way so that it's parallel to the wind direction, and so it would produce as little drag as possible. And so by pushing those buttons, if you needed to kill the engine, if you hit this button, that would automatically feather that engine so that the prop would go like this so that it produced the least drag, and it would fire another fire bottle. And so there are also other fire bottles here. These are additional fire extinguishers that they could use because fire was a big problem on the aircraft, particularly on the ocean. Here are mag switches. Mags, that's short for magnetos. They basically provide a high voltage current to the spark plugs. And there are two of them on every engine. There's a left and a right. So these would be the mag switches. And this here, this is the flap, retract, and extend switches. So flaps are on the trailing edge of the wing. They would drop down and they would increase the surface area of the wing, which would generate more lift when you're at slow flight, such as landing. And then we have right here, this is the most important button on the aircraft. This is the steward call button. This is how you get your coffee. And then you have your lap strap and your no smoking sign. The no smoking sign is off. Actually, the lamp should be lit right now because no smoking on this aircraft. We talked about the flaps. This is the rudder trim, the aileron trim, and the nose trim. So this would be the elevator trim here. So these are all the trim tabs up here. And what that would do is that would take the aerodynamic forces off of the control surfaces so that it was less difficult to fly the aircraft, because this isn't a hydraulic aircraft. This is all done with cables. So there are direct cable linkages from the control column all the way to the flight controls. The only automatic thing that was electrical were the flaps. Because the flaps were electrical, they actually had a manual backup. And the manual backup is in the galley. You would pop the lid off the counter, and then actually you could raise and lower the flaps with a crank from the kitchen of the aircraft. You had to be able to do much more than make coffee if you were a steward on one of these Solents. This interesting red knob here is it's red, so it must be important. And what this is this is the way that you released a tail hook. So when you were being towed off of the beach or being towed back up onto a beach, either by another launch craft or some other vehicle, and what this would do is that when you were on the water, the pilot would reach up here and then pull this down, and then that tail hook would disengage, and then the aircraft would be free to float forward and then take off. And then the first thing that you would do is, usually if you're taking one of these things off, is you would fly parallel to the beach, and then you would start your the engine that was on the beach side. So if the beach is on your starboard side, you would start the starboard engine, and then you would start that and get that moving. Then the aircraft would actually move. That engine would drag the aircraft in a half circle, and hopefully by the time you were again parallel with the beach, you would have your outboard port engine running, and so then you'd be able to run straight. And then you go out to your taxi area, and I believe the takeoff run. And so then you would taxi off to the you would taxi off and do your run up, and you would check, make sure that all your instruments were working, and then you would once all those are working on the outboard engines, you would turn around to 180 degree when you're at the far edge of the waterway or your takeoff area that you had intended, and then you would start engines 2 and 3, which are these ones here, and then you would take off. And I believe the takeoff, I think this would take off at about 1,200 yards. So it took a significant amount to take off, but it was a pretty low airspeed to take off. I think you could be on the step at 50 knots, and on the step is where you're basically all the outboard floats are out of the water, and you're on the step is when you've got just about 8 feet of the hull in the water, and you're just kind of like bouncing along on the surface. And it's a very dynamic part of the flight there. And then with just a little bit more power and nose up, when you pull the yoke back, you lift up, and then you would be airborne at 65 knots, which is about 75 miles an hour. So it had such a huge wing, it took off very, very quickly, and it really wanted to fly. But yeah, let's see, what else do we have here? We've got your usual standard flight instruments here. This is hello, this is your captain speaking. That's all about. You've got one set of radios here, and then you've got basic switches right there. And then of course you've got your rudders down there. It looks like what is that back there? I think that's that must be it looks like a deodorizer. I guess the last pilot had stinky feet. So these are the rudder pedals, and I think that's about it. We have here some bunks here. So Bill, explain what these are, because
The bunks would not normally be used in flight because the legs weren't that long. But when the aircraft was in port, it came under the rules of the ship, so it couldn't be left unattended. And also, at times, they would carry gold bullion from South Africa back to England, and they needed the security.
right.
So it'd be very rare that they would be used in flight, but a couple of lower ranking crew members would have to stay on board.
The average, I think this had a duration of about 10 or 11 hours of flight. I know the Sunderland had like 16 hours, but this was.
There was some some trips that were less, but the average was probably about 6 to 10 hours, depending on where they were going.
Right. So you would land on you would alight on the water, and then the passengers wouldn't sleep on this aircraft. There were some flying boats where passengers they had sleeping berths, but not this aircraft. And this would carry 34 passengers, and then they would have a launch pull up. In fact, if you want to see how it looks, I know we have a short little video clip of this aircraft landing on the Thames back in 1949. So Rod, play that lovely video footage of the short Solent landing on the Thames, if you can. We're about to show where the navigator would use the sextant. This was the last aircraft to ever have an astrodome, which was where the navigator would stick out a sextant, which is a maritime navigational device, and you would use it to find where you were through the position of the stars and the sun or the moon. So there's a little hole right there, and there's a picture of it being used. So excellent, we can see that. So this is that's our navigator peeking out through the top hatch, which we're going to climb out of in a second. And okay, thank you, Rod. Let's go back to me, and you can see this is Bill in here holding the top hatch, and you can see the opening. We taped it over just to keep the birds and the rain out, but that's where they would stick the sextant. And so here you have this fantastic aviation equipment, and they would still use a sextant to navigate. Interestingly, a sextant was also used in a much more modern aircraft on Apollo 13, where Jim Lovell used a sextant in order to calculate their re-entry angle to get back in the final burn to land on planet Earth again after they had that accident in Apollo 13. You can see that in the movie Apollo 13. So here we have the top hatch here.
No, I'll get out of the way, Steve.
Okay, great. So this, we're just going to pop up very quickly. And here, this is what it looks like on top of the aircraft. So beside each engine, I don't know if you can see it or if you can hear me, but there would be a hinged area that would drop down, and the engineer would actually be able to stand as this is floating in order to get access to the engines. And you can see the gill flaps there. We call them cow flaps now, but those provide coolant to the engine during takeoff and climb and landing. And but on each side of the engine, there would be a section that could drop down, and it was a step. And Rod, if you can show that picture while I climb back into the aircraft, what they would do with that is that not only was it used to provide service to the engines, but also in order to start these Hercules engines, they would actually have to stand beside the engine and manually turn every prop 2 full rotations before they could start every engine. So you can imagine being out in the cold, trying to fly back to Southampton, you're freezing and you're turning the props in order to get the oil running through all the cylinders and to make sure that nothing is obstructing the operation of the engine. So you'd have to manually turn every prop 2 times before even starting the engine. Okay, now we're going to go aft. So Bill, I'll catch up with you. You want to go? Do you go down or do you want? Okay, so Bill's going to take the long road. I'm going to take the high road. So Rod, if you wouldn't mind, if you had that picture of the engineer outside the aircraft.
I had it displayed just a second. Hold on.
Oh yeah, okay, great. I was busy trying to come down the ladder and not kill myself. Okay. This is that's the quick way down. You might lose my signal for a minute here. I'm going to crawl through here. It takes some acrobatics. So here we are. Okay, and so this is the galley, and this is actually where the manual override for the flap would be. You would lift this panel up here, and then there'd be a crank, and you could raise and lower the flaps if you had to. This is the galley. They would serve great meals here, including poached fish and chicken and bouffe de Bourdain, and all from this little galley here. So here we are. This is in the main cabin here on the upper deck. This is what it would look like. Here's a picture of all the happy passengers aboard. Actually, it's not just a happy passenger. This is actually a still from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that's Indiana Jones right there. And I don't know, that guy, he looks like trouble. So I'm not gonna, no spoiler alerts. If you haven't seen the movie yet, what have you been doing with your life in your cave? I encourage you to see it. It's a very good movie. Oh, look at that. That's Indiana Jones's fedora. So that's actually where he sat. This here is an example of the table service, or actually, it looks like the table isn't set. But tell us a little bit about the
tables are removable. They fold up and they fit into holes in the wall there. And things will fall over if you don't watch out.
It's a high gravity day, Bill.
The leg here. So they would, after they were done, they would remove them and store them in a compartment at the aft end. This up here is an escape hatch. This is the ladder they would use to get up there. And I've never taken it down. I don't think it'd be a good idea to try after all these years.
Right. Now, what do we have here? We have cargo hold number 2.
Up here, this is access to the cargo compartment. You can't open the cargo compartment. You have to go down through here and open it. and then they can load the cargo.
And if this were in wartime, then this is where the position for the tail gunner would be. And again, they'd probably have a set of twin 20 millimeters.
And also, this gives you an idea of the construction of the aircraft without the trim, the paneling.
So yeah, so you can see all the stringers and the frame of the aircraft, and yeah, make it as lightweight as possible. The aircraft was made out of aluminum, except for the control surfaces were often covered in fabric. Like, yeah, these were mostly covered, but particularly the tail surfaces. There, we look out here, you can see the flaps. That's closest to us on the trailing edge there, and then the outer edge you have the ailerons. And everything was done. It was all direct cable, so no, nothing automatic. It was all cable control of the flight services. So now we're going to go below into the lower deck. So are there any questions at this point?
There were a couple that came through.
It was designed in 1945. The war ended before this could be put into military service, and so they immediately. In fact, Bill, if you want to tell us a bit of the history about how this was converted to a passenger aircraft.
Yes. They thought after the Germany surrendered that they would use the aircraft in the Pacific. And then luckily that did not become necessary. They were put in storage at the British Air Force Base in Scotland. It's still in the military configuration. And then BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, made a larger aircraft for their route from Southampton, England to Johannesburg, South Africa.
Here's the lady's head.
They
lavatory.
got one, tried it out, and it worked fine. So they had to reconfigure the passenger configuration. The guns were taken out, and of course the seats were put in. So that's basically how it became a passenger plane.
Oh, excellent. And then this only flew to Johannesburg for a few years, and then it went to the Pacific, which is why we see this fantastic Tahitian artwork here. So tell us a bit about that. This was actually bought by another airline, and then it flew from Honolulu to Tahiti, right?
It was bought by South Pacific Airlines. They brought this one and two other ones here for modification and overhaul. But in the meantime, the wife of the owner had the paintings commissioned.
Oh, great. And then this was actually purchased by Howard Hughes, am I right?
Yes, that's right. For a while, he owned all three aircraft. They were kept under guard, and nobody was quite sure what he wanted to do with them.
He was probably trying to get all the gold dust out of the hull.
Maybe.
But yeah, so he had it for 9 years, and then sold, and then
there was speculation that he was going to use them for research for the flying boats.
Oh, the Hercules and his
other possibility that the one get research for the one he was building.
Right.
But that did not work out. So they just kept them under guard, and then eventually.
Oh, that's great. So let's go forward a bit, and then we'll end the tour on the outside. So
Dan,
it looks like we've got.
The question was asked, what was the range of the aircraft?
Oh, the range of the aircraft was I think it was like 2,200 miles. So this is a clip. Is always playing here, the day and night here in the Solent. This is the oh look. This is what I was trying to show you.
This 35-ton twin-deck Solent flying boat is out to make history. Swooping low over St. Paul's, the pilot plans to bring the flying giant down on the Thames.
That is not this aircraft.
All work stops on the river
Same type.
as the Solent comes down to make a perfect landing along Lighthouse Reach. For the first time for 21 years, a flying boat comes to the Pool of London.
So there's the bowsman out the front.
The 2 million mile man. The Solent's luxury appearance is a perfect example of Britain's progress in civil aviation.
Oh, and here we have Indiana Jones. This is this aircraft. I see this magazine actually upstairs. It's like the same magazine.
Showing flying in the movie, they're not flying in the movie.
Yeah. This is CGI.
The movie destination was Nepal.
Yeah.
That would have been quite a trip.
Yeah. There have been lots of different hops.
So maybe you can do anything.
Also, it's anachronistic because this aircraft wasn't built till 1945, and this, as you know, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Spoiler alert: it takes place in during World War II. So we're going to go forward very briefly. This is baggage hold number 1. Looks like one of our passengers lost their luggage. Hopefully we can get back to them. Going through here, this is the section here. This would ordinarily be, for those of you people who were asking about the war service, this is what would be where the 12mm forward turret would be. But since this was peacetime, they didn't have the turret, and this would just be like a hatch that they would open up. And so this would be where the bowsman would stand, as we can see, and then they would drop out those drogue chutes, and then they would. This here is a device where they would open this up, and this is a cleat. So if you're, and this cleat would drop down, and you could hook the. I can't see whether it's a cleat or a hook, and then that would be where they would put the lines on to moor it to the buoy, and then pull it along. So this would be. Inside, this is a. There you go. This is an unfortunate bird's eye view of the Solent right into the windscreen. And we're going to go back in, and we're going to take a quick walk while we still have time of give you a tour on the outside of the aircraft. So, Rod, feel free to send us any questions that people might have, and be happy to answer them. So I'm going to go at, what do we? Oh, so
There was a
this here, by the way.
There was a question where is the lavatory?
Oh, there's several lavatories. The first of all, this is not a lavatory. This is the backside of the instrument panel, and it's an interesting view. It's also a great way. So if you were a
Maintenance access hatch.
yeah, maintenance access hatch, so you could check out the backside of the instruments, and also tie the pilot's shoelaces together if you were bored on a long flight. Okay, so now we're going to go aft and out.
Men's lavatory.
Okay, so this is the men's lavatories,
Men's washroom.
men's washroom. So they would have a washroom and a lavatory, 2 separate ones. And then there was, as we go back here, you can see the aft lavatory, which was the real swanky one for the women. And so here, this is the women's lavatory. There's a missing mirror. We're trying to fix that. Too many people were playing Bloody Mary here last night. So but yeah, so this is pretty swanky. And in fact, I think Rod has a picture of people in this area on this aircraft sipping from the enjoying their life from the bar. Of course, there's the telephone that the pilot would call back and ask for his drink. No, he wouldn't do it. The rule is 8 inches bottle to throttle. Oh no, wait, it was 8 hours bottle to throttle, I think is what it was. So you couldn't drink within 8 hours before flying. So this here, okay,
This is from the movie.
Oh, this is from the movie. Okay.
Looks like it's in the water at a dock.
Uh-huh.
This is the aircraft without the special effects.
Oh, wow. So this is what it actually looked like. Movie magic.
Yes,
So, Bill, from what I hear you saying, you can't believe what you see in the movies.
that's true.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, we're going to quickly take a walk outside just to show you a bit more of this aircraft from the outdoors. So I'm going to put in my earbuds. Okay, good. Awesome. All right. So as I mentioned, mentioned earlier, this is the tail hook. This is what that red lever is. And the flight deck, and then that would detach this. And this trolley here was not on the aircraft. They would have, this is part of the beaching gear. This is a flying boat, and so it was not meant to land on a runway. And these types of boats are very popular before the war because it made sense to have flying boats. They were very popular, which is why the Pan Am Clipper, the Boeing, remember what model it was, but they would be very popular because just about every major city was next to a waterway. And so it made sense to have flying boats come in because you didn't need to have an airport. You could just use any port. And so flying boats were very popular. But then World War II happened, and then they had to build a lot of military runways, and the United States basically paved over every island in the Pacific on the way to Japan. And because of that, it made it much easier for larger and faster aircraft that were land-based to hop around the world. And that spelled so even though World War II gave birth to this aircraft, it also was the means of its end. And so that spelled the end of flying boats like these. And these gear here, this is these are beaching gear, and they wouldn't carry these along. These would be waiting for them at their ultimate destination or the maintenance facility, and they would have cork on the outside so that they would float, and then they would float these out to them, and they would hook them onto the wing like this, and then they would basically just tow this onto the beach. In fact, Rod has a picture of this very aircraft, I believe, towed onto the beach at San Francisco Airport after it went out of service, right when it was purchased by Howard Hughes. This is a photo of this aircraft being barged from San Francisco, actually probably from San Pablo. Can't remember where it was at this point, but this is when it was purchased by the current owners and then brought over and donated to the museum in 1987. So this is how the boat looked from the outside. We only have a couple of minutes left on this tour here. So again, these are the engines. This should be the hatch that the passengers would do ingress and egress out of. And this here is on the side here, this little float. This would ordinarily be attached, one on each the outside, the outboard part of each wing, under each wing, to keep the wings from dipping into the water. Right. So it's missing the tail because during an air show, actually, Bill, what's the story of our tail?
The rudder is missing. That happened. The aircraft was over at Northfield. Brought it from Richmond or to Northfield by barge, and they were charging people to go through it and working on it. And they had an air show there, and a military cargo jet turned too soon to taxi out, and the jet blast took the rudder off.
Oh wow!
We do have the rudder now. But it'd be a big project to get it up there. Operation, just get it in place. That's on our wish list if we could get it in place.
And we'll make sure we make this a no-fly zone. Don't want any more jet blast. Caution wait for everyone. Okay, anything else?
We had a couple questions.
Okay.
What is the overall weight of the aircraft?
75,000 pounds.
And it said, did this exact plane go from war, a passenger plane, or all of that model?
All of the models. There are 5 of these built, and they were all converted into airliners for the British Overseas Airport, but then eventually in later years sold to other types of. They were sold to other airlines as well. And then there were Mark 4s, which are used by the Tasman, Empire Airlines, and Teal. And so you had for the period of between about 1949 until about 1957 or so, that was the heyday of these aircraft, particularly flying in the late 50s in the Pacific from island to island. And then the 707 jet came out in 1958, at the end of 1958. And because they could carry so many more passengers faster, that the Boeing 707 pretty much put the nail in the coffin when it came to flying boats, because it was so easy to fly around the world on that. So that's why there are so few of these. Again, this is the only intact Solent Mark III in existence. So with that, there are not any more questions before we go. I just want to remind people to visit the Oakland Aviation Museum, oaklandaviationmuseum.org, and donate if you can, if you like the tour. If you didn't like the tour, donate to the Hiller Aviation Museum. We'll see you next time. Please join us here in Oakland at the Oakland International Airport off of Earhart Way.